On a stormy night, Dr. Jonathan Whitmore entered an emergency surgery, unaware that it would change his life forever. A young woman, frantic and unsure of who the father of her children was, found herself giving birth to 3 babies with pitch-black skin. Terrified, she fled, leaving them behind without a word. From a lonely man, Jonathan made an unexpected decision to adopt the 3 abandoned children, despite the fierce opposition from his family and society. 15 years later, a shocking revelation occurs when the biological mother returns. But does she truly want to make amends? Or is there a hidden secret she's keeping? Watch until the end so you don't miss a single moment of this emotional story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you so much. The rain poured relentlessly, with heavy raindrops pounding against the hospital windows, creating a rhythmic tapping sound as if signaling a stormy night ahead. Inside the on-call room, the fluorescent lights emitted a faint glow, reflecting off Dr. Jonathan Whitmore's gaunt face. He had just completed a lengthy surgery, his eyes hollowed from exhaustion. He sank into the chair, intending to close his eyes for just a moment. But before he could even lean back, the phone's ringer pierced the silence, shattering the calm. Jonathan reached for the phone, and the voice on the other end was frantic. Emergency. A pregnant woman is in critical condition. The ambulance will be here in 3 minutes. Immediately, his body tensed, and any trace of fatigue was pushed aside by his professional instincts. Jonathan jumped to his feet and rushed out of the on-call room. Down the corridor, an urgent announcement blared over the intercom, signaling an imminent life-or-death situation. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the night, cutting through the stillness of the hospital. The rain battered the pavement relentlessly, mixing with the flashing red lights reflected on the wet ground. As the ambulance came to a stop outside the emergency entrance, the doors flew open, and immediately, 2 medical staff rushed to push the stretcher inside. The young woman lay on the stretcher, her body convulsing violently with every painful contraction. Her face was pale, her skin cold as if she had lost all warmth. Her long hair was matted with sweat and rain, sticking to her thin cheeks. Her trembling hands gripped the side of the bed as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Her chest heaved, her breath short and labored, each inhale coming with sharp, agonizing pain. Jonathan moved quickly to the stretcher, his sharp eyes scanning the patient. He had witnessed countless life-or-death emergencies, but something about this woman set him on edge in an inexplicable way. She was so young, no older than her 20s, yet the wide-eyed look in her gaze reflected not just physical pain, but a profound panic, an unspoken fear that seemed deeper than anything he had seen before. He bent down, trying to make eye contact with her. "Listen to me. Can you talk? What's your name? Do you have anyone with you?" She blinked weakly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but only hoarse, breathless sounds escaped her throat. Another wave of pain gripped her, causing her body to jerk violently. The nurses around her quickly held her down, preparing for the critical situation ahead. Finally, with the little strength left, she grabbed Jonathan's sleeve, clutching it desperately. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath quick and shallow. Her voice was a fragile whisper, almost carried away by the wind. "Please save my baby." As soon as the words left her lips, another wave of pain hit, draining the last of her strength. Her hands slipped from Jonathan's, falling limp to the bed. A nurse screamed, blood pressure dropping rapidly. "We need to move now." Jonathan clenched his fists and gave a firm order. "Get her into the operating room. Prepare immediately." The stretcher rolled quickly down the long hallway, the wheels screeching against the tile floor. Medical staff ran alongside, gearing up for a life-threatening surgery that no one knew would change everything. In the sterile white light of the operating room, the tension in the air was palpable. Jonathan Whitmore, his face drawn with exhaustion, stood over the operating table, his every movement precise and calculated. The beeping of the monitor was the only sound besides the rustling of medical staff as they worked to save a life that hung by a thread. The young woman who had arrived just minutes ago lay motionless, her body fighting against the unbearable pain of labor and her life slipping away with each breath she took. Her skin, pale and clammy with sweat, seemed to glow under the harsh lights, as though she were fading from the world entirely. Her heart rate is dropping rapidly. We need to move faster. A nurse's voice broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. Jonathan's hands flew over the surgical instruments with the steady precision of years of training. Each motion was swift and sure, fighting against the clock and the growing danger. In that moment, it felt as if the room itself held its breath, every second stretching into an eternity. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like a battle against fate. Jonathan barely noticed the beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he focused entirely on the task at hand, determined not to let the mother slip away. Time passed in a blur, and then, after what seemed like an eternity, the first sound broke through, the piercing cry of a newborn, a tiny voice strong and full of life, shattering the silence of the room. Jonathan felt his heart race with relief, the first victory in this deadly game. But the battle wasn't over. He worked quickly, his hands moving faster now, pulling the second and third babies from the mother's exhausted body. Each cry was a promise of life, each sound a precious miracle. But then, the moment that should have been filled with joy, with a sense of triumph and relief, shattered into a scene none of them could have anticipated. The nurse carefully placed the first baby in the mother's arms, and as she slowly opened her eyes, the entire room held its collective breath. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Her gaze locked onto her child's face, and then, as if struck by a jolt of electricity, her body stiffened. Her breath caught, and her eyes dulled as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. Her hand, which had been gently cradling her baby, froze midair. Jonathan's instincts kicked in, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. He moved toward her, his mind racing, and then it happened. The woman shot up from the bed, her body jerking with panic as if she had been awakened from a nightmare. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She recoiled, her arms instinctively wrapping around herself as if to protect herself from an invisible threat. Her face, already pale, drained of color entirely, leaving her ghostly white. "No, no, no, no," she gasped, her voice breaking, eyes wide with disbelief. She turned her head to the side, looking at the other two babies lying in their cribs, as though she were waiting for them to change, waiting for some sign that things weren't as they seemed. But the truth was right before her eyes. The three babies, so small and fragile, had skin as dark as night. The mother's face twisted in horror, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Then her voice broke the silence with a frantic cry. "It can't be. This can't be happening." Her head shook violently, a desperate attempt to deny the truth that was right before her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation, as though something or someone could explain the inexplicable. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and her hands reached out to grasp the bedsheet so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the veins in her arms standing out in sharp relief. Jonathan stepped forward, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as the nurses froze in place, unsure of what to do. The woman's wild, panicked gaze moved from the babies to the medical staff and back again, as if she were searching for a way out, a way to undo what had just happened. Her breathing was erratic, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. A nurse, unsure of how to react, stepped forward, her hand outstretched in an attempt to comfort the distraught woman. But the moment her hand touched the woman's shoulder, the mother recoiled violently, as though burned by the touch. Her eyes locked onto the nurse, wide with terror, and she screamed, "No, no, they're not mine. These aren't my babies." Jonathan's heart sank. He moved toward her, trying to calm her, to bring her back from the edge of madness. "You're in shock. You've just given birth. You need to calm down. These are your children," he said, his voice steady but firm, attempting to instill some sense of logic into the chaos. But she didn't hear him. She was lost in her own panic, her body shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in desperate gasps. Her eyes darted around the room wildly, as though she were searching for an escape, for a reason to make sense of the madness unfolding before her. And then, without warning, she muttered something so chilling that it froze everyone in the room. "I don't know who their father is." Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an unsettling truth. The room fell into stunned silence. the weight of her revelation sinking into the hearts of everyone present. The question echoed through Jonathan's mind, bouncing round in his thoughts unanswered. What did she mean? The air in the operating room had changed. It was no longer filled with the hope of new life, but with confusion and fear. The three innocent children lay in their cribs, their dark skin the only thing that connected them to their mother, and yet she could not claim them as her own. The mystery was just beginning, and Jonathan knew that what had started as a simple emergency surgery had now spiraled into something far darker, something no one could have predicted. As the nurses looked at each other, unsure of what to do next, Jonathan's mind raced. What secret was this woman hiding? Why did she deny her own children? And what was the truth behind her desperate words? The answers, he knew, would only come at a cost, one that no one in that room could yet comprehend. The storm outside continued to rage, a fitting metaphor for the chaos that had just erupted within the walls of the operating room. The night was far from over, and the questions that hung in the air were just the beginning of a journey no one would ever forget. Outside the hospital, the rain showed no signs of letting up, with gusts of wind whipping through the barren trees, casting trembling shadows against the stark white walls. Tonight was a long night, not just because of the thunder that rumbled outside, but also because of the events that had just unfolded in the operating room. After the violent panic, the young woman was sedated to calm her frayed nerves. But even as she drifted into a deep, restless sleep, her face remained marked with shock, as though even in her dreams, she couldn't accept the reality she had just been forced to face. The three newborns lay in the crib beside her bed, their tiny bodies moving gently with every faint breath. The dim, yellowish light from the bedside lamp illuminated their fragile faces, highlighting the pitch-black skin that their mother seemed unable to accept. A nurse quietly tucked a blanket around the babies, then quietly left the room, leaving behind a quiet space filled only with the rhythmic sound of the rain tapping against the window. The clock struck 2 in the morning. The hospital was still alive with the bustle of shifts changing, footsteps echoing down the corridors, and the hum of machines running tirelessly in the rooms next door. No one paid attention to the young woman. No one realized that on this very rainy night, she would make a decision that would forever alter the fate of her 3 children. She opened her eyes, waking in the darkness, her pupils dilating as she stared up at the cold, sterile ceiling. Her breath was quick, the images from the operating room still vivid in her mind. She glanced to her side. The 3 babies were still there, sleeping peacefully like little angels. But to her, they could never be her children. Her trembling hand gripped the edge of the blanket, her breath coming in short gasps, tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stay. She couldn't accept this reality. With a sudden, wild determination, she slowly pushed the blanket aside, her bare feet touching the cold, hard floor. A shiver ran down her spine, but she didn't stop. Looking around the silent room, she crept toward the door, each step as light as a ghost's. She knew that if anyone saw her, they would stop her. She knew she should stay, but the fear inside her had completely overtaken her reason. The hospital door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind bit into her skin as she stepped out into the night. No one saw. No one knew. All that was left were 3 helpless babies lying silently in their crib, waiting for a mother's embrace they would never have. The first light of dawn broke through the fogged windows, weak and filtered, casting a soft glow on the cold, empty corridors of the hospital. The rainstorm from the night before had left behind a heavy, lingering chill, and the sound of droplets tapping gently against the glass echoed through the stillness. Slowly, the hospital came to life. The shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant murmur of doctors preparing for their shifts. It was the beginning of another busy day. But today was different. A nurse, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, entered the room where the young mother had been. She had come to check on her patient, expecting the usual post-delivery signs. But when the door swung open, her heart skipped a beat. The room was eerily empty. The bed was untouched, the blankets tossed aside as if someone had hastily fled. The sterile smell of the room hung in the air, but there was no sign of the young woman who had given birth just hours ago. She scanned the room frantically, her gaze darting from corner to corner, trying to find any clue as to where the patient could have gone. But all that greeted her was the faint light of the morning pouring through the window, illuminating the cold tile floor. A soft breeze rustled the curtain by the window, and the nurse noticed a small piece of paper lying on the pillow. It fluttered slightly, as if beckoning her to come closer. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The ink was smudged and barely readable. The words were written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. "Please forgive me. I can't raise them." Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words over and over, unable to comprehend their meaning. The weight of the note, heavy with desperation and sorrow, sank into her chest. She gripped it tighter, as if she could hold on to some semblance of the woman who had written it. But the chill creeping down her spine told her that something terrible had just unfolded. The nurse's heart raced. She spun around and rushed out of the room, her voice urgent and frantic as it broke through the calm morning bustle. "The mother is gone. Patient in bed number 17 is no longer here." Her words echoed through the hospital, quickly drawing attention from the doctors and nurses around her. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered at the door to the room, their faces pale and shocked. One of the doctors pushed past the nurse, heading straight to the security office to review the cameras. The tension in the air thickened as everyone waited for the footage to load. When the footage finally came up, it showed a blurry figure walking silently through the hospital halls late in the night. The woman moved quickly, blending into the storm outside, her figure swallowed by the heavy downpour. No one saw her leave. No one knew where she had gone. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Jonathan, who had just entered the administrative area, was immediately informed of the situation. His hand froze on the doorframe as he listened to the nurse's words, the weight of the paper in her hands heavy in his mind. When he looked down at it, his expression darkened. The shock, the disbelief, the pain, it all surged within him in that one fleeting moment. His eyes clouded with a profound sadness, a heaviness that threatened to swallow him whole. It wasn't anger that consumed him, but a knowing feeling of helplessness. Jonathan turned his gaze, shifting to the patient room. The 3 newborns lay in their cribs, completely unaware of what had just transpired. Their tiny forms, so fragile and innocent, slept peacefully, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded in the night. Jonathan's chest tightened as he looked at them, realizing the truth. The woman who had brought them into the world was gone, and with her, she had taken a part of their story. The room seemed colder now, the silence stretching unbearably long. Jonathan could hear nothing but the soft, steady breath of the babies as they slept, completely unaware of the devastation that had just unfolded. The world outside seemed to continue as usual, indifferent to the lives of these 3 innocent children who would never know the love of the woman who had given them life. As Jonathan stood there, his mind raced with 1,000 questions, but no answers came. Why had she left? What had driven her to make such a desperate, irreversible decision? And what would happen to these children, now left behind in a world that had already shown them so much pain? The morning light seemed almost cruel now, its gentle warmth falling on the empty room, the abandoned cribs. Jonathan knew that this was only the beginning of a story much darker than anyone had anticipated. And somehow, he felt in his bones that the truth, when it came, would shake them all to the core. The atmosphere in the hospital conference room was so heavy it felt as if the air could be sliced into pieces. Doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators sat around the long table, their faces etched with tension. In front of them lay the file of the 3 abandoned newborns, tiny lives, not even a day old, already deprived of the one person who should have loved and cared for them most. An elderly doctor cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched on for what felt like an eternity. "We have no other choice. An orphanage is the best place for these children." A few people nodded in agreement. A nurse spoke up, her voice laced with sympathy, but firm from years of witnessing too many similar situations. "No one in this hospital can adopt all 3 children at once. This is not the first time we've dealt with a case like this." Another doctor shrugged, his gaze pragmatic. "As heartbreaking as it is, this is the most reasonable solution. We can't keep them here much longer." But amidst the discussions, Jonathan remained silent. He didn't look at the file, didn't care for the numbers or administrative procedures. He stood near the window, his eyes fixed on the neonatal ward where the 3 babies lay in their white cribs. Their frantic cries echoed through the glass, a mournful melody that wormed its way into his mind. They were so small, so fragile in a world so cold. And what haunted Jonathan more than anything was the terrified look in the mother's eyes when she saw them, a fear so intense that she chose to flee rather than face the truth. Had these three little souls already been cast aside by fate after just one night? They had barely been in the world for 24 hours, not even given a name, a loving embrace. And now they were being sent to a place no one would ever want to go. Jonathan clenched his fists, his heart filled with emotions he couldn't name. When one of the council members turned to him and asked, "Dr. Whitmore, do you have any thoughts on this?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his gaze still locked on the tiny lives crying out, their voices hoarse and unheard. His heart tightened with a feeling that refused to let go. How could he just leave them? How could he not do something? The weight of the decision pressed on him, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't simply walk away. These babies, so innocent and helpless, needed someone to fight for them. The room seemed to fade away as he made his choice. He couldn't be a bystander. He couldn't let these children face a future devoid of love and hope. The voices around him continued, but Jonathan's mind was already made up. The thought of leaving them to the cold, impersonal walls of an orphanage was unbearable. There had to be another way. He would find it. For the sake of those three crying babies, he would find a way to give them a life filled with something more than just survival. He would give them a chance. That night, Jonathan tossed and turned on the stiff bed in the on-call room. But no matter how long he kept his eyes shut, sleep never came. In his mind, the image of the three abandoned newborns replayed over and over, like a haunting ghost. They were so small, so fragile, and utterly unaware that the world had already rejected them the moment they were born. Jonathan had witnessed many children grow up in orphanages, their empty eyes and withered hearts starved of love and affection. He remembered the children he had met through medical charity programs. Kids without families, with no one to comfort them when they fell, no one to celebrate their birthdays. He knew what awaited these three babies if they were sent away: a cold system, portion meals, stiff hugs from overburdened staff. Jonathan sat up in bed, his hands gripping his head as he struggled with his own thoughts. He wasn't an irresponsible man, nor was he someone who acted on impulse. But this time, something deep within him urged him forward. It was a feeling foreign, yet oddly familiar: responsibility. But what could he do? He had never been married. His work offered no room for such attachments. And if he adopted these three children, everything would change forever. Such a decision could never be undone. The entire hospital would talk. His colleagues would think he was insane. Yet, as he stood before the window, gazing into the neonatal ward where the three little ones slept peacefully in their white cribs, Jonathan knew that there was no other choice. They had no one. They needed a father. And though he had never once considered having children, he knew deep in his heart that if he turned away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The following morning, to the astonishment of the hospital board and the opposition of his colleagues, Jonathan filled out the adoption papers for all three babies. When he signed his name, there was no hesitation, no trembling hand, for in that moment, he knew that from now on, he was not just a doctor but a father. The news spread faster than the chill winds of early winter. Within a single night, the entire hospital knew that Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a bachelor, a renowned surgeon, had adopted three abandoned newborns. But what stirred the most gossip was not just his bold decision, but the undeniable truth. All three babies had pitch-black skin. In a society still rife with prejudice, the fact that a white man had adopted three black children became a topic of fierce debate. His colleagues looked at him with a mix of surprise and scrutiny. Some whispered as he passed through the hospital halls, their words seeming harmless but thick with implication. "What's he thinking?" a young doctor shrugged as he spoke to a colleague. "A single man adopting three kids? And black ones at that? What is he trying to prove?" Another nurse shook her head, her voice low but loud enough for Jonathan to hear. "I admire Dr. Whitmore's kindness, but this is a bit strange." But the gossip at the hospital wasn't the worst part. When he returned home, Jonathan faced another storm, one from his family. His parents, who valued reputation and social standing above all else, couldn't believe their ears when they heard the news. "What do you mean by this?" His father's voice came through the phone, cold and stern. "Our family has a legacy, a reputation, and now you've made yourself the laughingstock of everyone." His mother, quietly sobbing, didn't raise her voice, but the words she spoke cut deeper than any angry outburst. Jonathan, you're not married. You live alone. And now you're adopting 3 children? Have you thought about your future? Have you thought about this family? No one understood. No one cared to know the real reason behind his decision. To them, Jonathan had broken every mold, gone against everything they had hoped for and expected. In just one night, he was disowned by his family. The phone no longer rang with calls of concern. Family dinners no longer had a seat for him. He became a stranger in his own home. But even as he lost everything, Jonathan didn't regret his choice. Because somewhere in the small house he now called home, there were 3 tiny lives that needed a father, and no matter how lonely he became, he would never turn his back on them. Jonathan walked down the hospital corridor, feeling every gaze heavy upon him. Conversations abruptly halted as he passed, and whispers grew louder behind his back. But he was used to it now. Ever since the day he signed the adoption papers for the 3 children, his life had been irrevocably altered. In the break room, a group of doctors was chatting animatedly, but as Jonathan entered, the atmosphere suddenly stilled. A longtime colleague, someone who had once held great respect for him, folded his arms and looked at him with a confused expression. How do you plan on living with 3 children who aren't even your own? You don't have a wife. You don't have a family. Where is this all going? Jonathan paused for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He knew they didn't mean any harm. They simply didn't understand. How could they? How could they possibly understand the feeling of seeing 3 tiny babies abandoned from the moment they were born? How could they feel the emptiness that he had tried to mask for so long? The emptiness he hadn't even realized until those 3 little lives came into his world. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his arms, where the smallest of the 3, Elijah, lay asleep, his rosy face pressed gently against Jonathan's chest. In the corner of the room, the other 2 children lay peacefully in their cribs, their tiny hands instinctively grasping at the air as if seeking something to hold on to. Jonathan let out a soft sigh before finally answering in a calm, yet firm voice. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that right now, they need me, and I will never leave them, just like this world did. The room fell silent. No one spoke another word. But Jonathan didn't mind anymore. He didn't need anyone to understand, and he didn't need anyone's approval. Because in that moment, as he looked down at the 3 innocent children in his arms, he knew that he had made the right choice. The first few months felt like an endless battle. Jonathan, a surgeon accustomed to scalpels and emergency rooms, now had to learn how to be a father, a role entirely foreign and brimming with challenges. He fumbled with mismatched diapers, rushed to prepare bottles, and tried to calm the ceaseless crying that echoed through the late-night hours. Every time one child cried, the others joined in like an orchestra of chaos, driving him to the brink of madness. His eyes were always swollen from sleepless nights, his shirts wrinkled, and his apartment quickly turned into a battleground littered with diapers and bottles. There were nights when all 3 children cried in unison, and he wondered if he was making a huge mistake. There were moments of utter despair when he looked into the mirror, seeing a man so exhausted he barely recognized himself. But then, one long night, as he struggled to get Elijah, the youngest, to sleep, the little one suddenly grabbed his finger, his tiny hand clinging on as if it never wanted to let go. A strange feeling washed over Jonathan's chest, something warm, something deeper than anything he had ever known. And in that instant, he realized he wasn't alone. Despite all the difficulties, he knew he had made the right choice. Each time he saw his children smile, every first babbling word they spoke, all his exhaustion seemed to fade away. Jonathan was no longer a lonely man. He was a father. And no matter what the world outside said, that was all that mattered to him. As time passed, Noah, Elijah, and Ava grew up in the warm embrace of Jonathan, a devoted father who selflessly sacrificed everything for his children. The small home that had once been the solitary refuge of a single man now brimmed with laughter, the pitter-patter of little feet, and the noisy sounds of 3 lively, energetic kids. Jonathan was no longer just a doctor focused on long, grueling surgeries. He was the father of 3 wonderful children, and he couldn't imagine his life without them. Despite the whispers of society, the curious eyes that followed him when he took his 3 black children to the park or dropped them off at school, Jonathan never paid any mind. What mattered to him was raising them to be good people, giving them a safe and loving home, a good education, and most importantly, a childhood free from the shadows of loneliness or the fear of abandonment. He taught Noah to read his first science books, patiently listened to Elijah's endless questions, and spent hours playing dolls with Ava when she would coyly ask him to help braid the doll's hair. There were nights after finishing a long surgery when Jonathan came home utterly exhausted. But the moment he stepped through the door, he was met by Ava running into his arms, Noah proudly showing off a new drawing, and Elijah eagerly telling him about a math puzzle he had just solved. It was in these moments that Jonathan realized, despite the struggles and sacrifices, his choice had never been wrong. No matter how the world saw him, to these 3 children, he would always be the best father in the world. His life, once a quiet, solitary existence, had been transformed. The simple act of coming home to these joyful moments made every difficulty worthwhile. Jonathan knew that his greatest accomplishment wasn't the surgeries he had performed, but the love and care he had poured into raising these children, ensuring they felt safe, cherished, and most importantly, loved. And in their eyes, Jonathan would forever be their hero. He was not just a father by title, but a father who had fought for them, stood by them, and given them the best gift of all, the gift of belonging. No matter how much Jonathan tried to shield his children, society outside was still slow to accept them. From the early years of school, Noah faced scrutinizing looks and harsh words from other kids. He couldn't understand why his classmates stared at him strangely when they saw a white man picking him up after school. One day, as Noah was happily eating lunch, a boy suddenly sneered, pushing Noah's food tray aside and mockingly saying, "You don't have a real dad. Your dad just picked you up from the street." Those words were like a knife stabbing into Noah's tender heart, leaving him stunned, his eyes wide with confusion, as he had never considered things in that way before. He couldn't understand why the other children treated him like that, especially when the love Jonathan had for him had never been anything but unconditional. Elijah, though the smartest kid in his class, was always underestimated. Every time he raised his hand to speak in class, the teacher would glance over him as if he wasn't there. When he scored high on a test, some dismissed it as mere luck. One time, a parent even objected when Elijah was chosen for the school's math team simply because he was a black child in a predominantly white school. Jonathan found out when his son came home, head hung low, clutching the test paper with excellent marks, but receiving no recognition. He looked at the test, full of pride, but no one saw it. No one acknowledged his effort. And when Jonathan looked into his son's eyes, he realized he wasn't just a father. He was also Elijah's protector from the harsh prejudices of the world. Of the 3 children, Ava was the strongest, but also the most rebellious. She never bowed to cruel words or injustice. Whenever she saw her brother being bullied, Ava would jump right in to fight the other kids, knowing full well that it would land her in trouble. One day, Jonathan received a call from the school saying that Ava had punched a boy for calling Noah a filthy adopted kid. When he arrived to pick her up, she stood tall despite the small cut on her lip. "They have no right to talk about him like that," she snapped, her eyes burning with fury. Ava, though just a child, was ready to stand up against injustice, and Jonathan felt proud of his courageous daughter. Seeing his children endure prejudice so early in life filled Jonathan with both heartbreak and anger. He knew that no matter how much love he gave them, the world outside would remain ruthless, ready to knock them down if they weren't strong enough to stand up. And that was what he needed to prepare them for, not just love, but the strength to face the harsh biases of life. He taught them to love themselves, to understand that skin color does not define a person's worth, and most importantly, he taught them never to give up, no matter how the world treated them. Jonathan knew that only mental strength and love could help his children navigate the challenges life would throw their way. That night, the house was enveloped in a quiet stillness, with only the soft chirping of insects outside the window and the gentle glow of the night light casting shadows on the walls. Jonathan sat on the sofa, one hand holding an unfinished medical textbook, the other gently rubbing Noah's back. The boy rested his head on his shoulder. Tonight, Noah seemed quieter than usual. He didn't talk much, like he often did, nor did he eagerly share what he had learned at school. His eyes were thoughtful, as if he was wrestling with some inner thought. Finally, Noah lifted his head, his voice soft but serious. Dad, do you regret adopting us? The question caught Jonathan off guard. He looked down at his son's innocent face, where worry filled his eyes, but there was also a fragility there, as if Noah was afraid to hear an answer he wasn't ready to face. Jonathan set the book down and turned to face his son, placing a hand gently on his curly hair. He ruffled Noah's head with a warm smile. No, Noah, I've never regretted it. Not even for a second. The boy looked at him, his eyes wide, as if trying to confirm what he had just heard. Jonathan continued, his voice deep but filled with complete sincerity. You three are the best thing that ever happened to me. Without you, I wouldn't know that my heart was capable of loving this much. Noah didn't say anything else, but the worry in his eyes slowly melted away, replaced by a small glimmer of reassurance. He smiled softly, and then, without thinking, he hugged Jonathan tightly. I love you, Dad, he whispered. Jonathan wrapped his arms around his son, feeling the warmth of the boy in his embrace, a connection that didn't need blood but was deeper than anything he had ever known. I love you too, Noah, he said, his voice full of love. In that moment, Jonathan knew that no matter how the world outside might view them, no matter how many prejudices surrounded them, inside this small house, love was the only thing that mattered, and that nothing could ever change. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the towering buildings, casting a soft orange hue across the sky, the last light of the day struggling to pierce through the clouds. Jonathan was driving home after a long and demanding day at the hospital, his mind still preoccupied with the details of a particularly complex surgery. But as he steered his car down the familiar narrow road leading to his house, something felt different. It was a small, unsettling feeling, like a change in the air, an inexplicable shift in the rhythm of his day. At first, he thought it was just the exhaustion settling in or perhaps the fatigue that always followed a long day of work. But then, as his headlights illuminated the front of his house, Jonathan noticed a figure standing in front of the door, a woman. She was standing still, her thin frame shivering slightly with each breeze. Her coat, worn and frayed at the edges, did little to protect her from the cool evening air. Her long, tangled hair hung loosely around her face, concealing it partially, but as Jonathan's car came to a stop, she raised her head. His eyes immediately met hers. Her eyes, swollen and red from hours, perhaps days, of crying, were filled with a sorrow so profound that Jonathan could feel it like a weight in his own chest. Her gaze held a deep, desperate sadness, a hollowed-out grief that resonated in the silence of the evening. He didn't recognize her, but there was something about the way she looked at him, a depth to her expression, that stirred an eerie sense of familiarity. Jonathan stepped out of the car slowly, his heart beginning to race. He couldn't move any faster, as if the world itself had slowed down around him. He didn't know her, but somehow, everything about this moment felt so inexplicably real, like a chapter of his life he had closed long ago had suddenly opened again. The woman inhaled deeply, as though drawing all her courage into one breath. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, cracked, as if it hadn't been used in years. Yet despite the rasp, every word came through with a weight that landed squarely in Jonathan's chest. I'm the mother of them, she said, her voice trembling but clear, carrying the pain of years unsaid. Her hands were clenched tightly around the hem of her coat, as though holding herself together, preventing herself from falling apart. I want to see my children. Time itself seemed to halt. The world went still around Jonathan. He stood there, his body frozen, his hands still resting on the door of his car. His heart pounded in his chest so loudly he could almost hear it in his ears, yet everything else felt muffled, distant, as if he were submerged in water. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words and unasked questions. The woman, the same woman who had disappeared so many years ago, leaving behind 3 tiny, helpless newborns abandoned in the cold of a stormy night, was now standing before him, asking to see the children she had abandoned without a trace. It was like a scene from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that Jonathan couldn't wake up from. His mind raced with a flood of emotions and thoughts: anger, confusion, disbelief. For 15 years, he had raised those children, his own, built a life around them, given them everything they needed: love, security, the safety of a home. And now, after all this time, she was back, standing there, asking to see them. Why now? After everything? Jonathan stared at her, speechless. His mouth was dry, and he struggled to find words. There were so many questions, so many things he wanted to say, but none of them came out. Why had she returned? What did she want? Was this some kind of cruel joke, or had something finally made her feel the loss, the emptiness of leaving her children all those years ago? Was she truly sorry, or was it something else? The silence stretched on, long and suffocating. Jonathan could feel the weight of her gaze, the desperation in her eyes as she waited for his response. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but no words would form. Instead, all he could do was stand there, caught in the gravity of the moment, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The woman's gaze never wavered, her body trembling in the cold, waiting for Jonathan's answer. He could see the fear in her eyes, fear of being rejected, of facing the consequences of her abandonment. But there was also something else, something deeper, a hope fragile and tentative that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for redemption. Jonathan slowly closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather himself, trying to steady the storm inside him. He had devoted his entire life to these children, and now here she was, asking to be a part of their lives once more. How could he even begin to process all of this? Finally, he opened his eyes, still feeling the weight of the woman's presence in front of him. But instead of the anger or the immediate outrage he thought he would feel, all he could sense was a deep, heavy sadness. For her, for the children, for the years lost in between. Jonathan clenched his fist, the blood rushing through his veins like wildfire. He had imagined this moment, when the mother who had abandoned the 3 children all those years ago would return. But he never imagined it would happen like this, so sudden and absurd that it left him unable to contain the boiling anger surging in his chest. He took a step closer to the woman, his gaze as cold as steel. You abandoned them 15 years ago. His voice was low but heavy, each word falling like a hammer. Now you want to come back? The woman flinched, her trembling hand clutching the hem of her coat, as if she had anticipated this reaction but was still unable to shield herself from the force of his fury. Tears welled up in her eyes, streaking down her gaunt cheeks, but Jonathan refused to let that soften him. He had been there from the very beginning, when the 3 children were left behind, when they cried in their cribs with no mother's arms to hold them. He had witnessed them grow up, facing the prejudice and ridicule of a society that saw them as different. And now she stood before him, claiming she wanted to meet them, as though she could erase everything with just a few words. Where have you been all these years? He snapped, his eyes sharp, as if they could pierce through her very soul. Do you know what they've gone through? Do you know that Noah cried all night when he realized he wasn't like the other kids? Do you know how Elijah was looked down upon despite being smarter than anyone else? Do you know how many times Ava had to fight just to protect her brothers from cruel words? The woman couldn't respond, her lips trembling, but Jonathan didn't stop. The pain and scars that the children had endured for so long surged in him when he stood before the one who had pushed them into this world without a second thought. He could no longer suppress his anger. They have a family. They have me. You're no longer a part of their lives, he said decisively, his voice as cold as an irrevocable sentence. The woman took a shaky breath, her eyes full of regret, but there was something deeper, something more painful than that. And then she spoke, her voice cracking but unwavering. I know, but I had no other choice. Jonathan froze. In that fleeting moment, his anger stilled, replaced by a strange sense of confusion. What was she saying? No other choice? Before he could react, the woman gasped for air, her voice breaking. Let me tell you the truth I've been hiding for 15 years. The 3 children stood in the living room, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief as they gazed at the strange woman standing at the door. Noah furrowed his brow, Elijah clenched his fists, and Ava, the strongest of them all, crossed her arms, her eyes cold and sharp as if trying to see through the stranger before her. They had never imagined this day would come, never thought they would meet the woman who had given them life. For all these years, Jonathan had been the only one they called Dad. Could this woman truly be their mother? Jonathan stood firmly in front of the 3 children, his voice unwavering and resolute. You can't just come back after 15 years and expect them to accept you as if nothing happened. He looked straight at the woman, his gaze sharp as a knife. You abandoned them. You have no right to be here." The woman lowered her head, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of her coat, as if she were struggling with herself. I know I have no right." She looked up, her eyes filled with tears, but also desperation. "But I didn't leave them because I wanted to. I was forced." Jonathan frowned deeply. The children exchanged confused glances. Ava suddenly spoke, her voice full of suspicion. "You were forced? What do you mean?" The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to reveal something she had hidden for 15 years. "I don't know who the father of your children is because I didn't willingly get pregnant." Her voice shattered with each word, her eyes dropping, filled with pain. The room fell into a deadly silence. Jonathan felt his body freeze, his hand instinctively clenching into a fist. The children stared at the woman before them, their mouths open with questions, but they were swallowed up by the horror that overwhelmed them. "I was assaulted," the woman continued, her voice choking, her shoulders trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, my family didn't accept it. They kicked me out, forced me to hide everything. I had no money, no one to help me. I was scared. I was in a panic. And when I saw you, when I saw my children, I couldn't face the truth. So I ran away." Tears streamed down her haggard face, but no one in the room spoke. The story she had just told was not just an excuse. It was a bitter truth, too painful for anyone to immediately accept. Jonathan felt a wave of chaotic emotions surge within him. Anger, pity, and above all, an indescribable sense of guilt and confusion. Noah, Elijah, and Ava stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. They had grown up without this woman, had a family with Jonathan, but now everything they knew about their past had been completely shattered. A truth they had never considered was now surrounding them, complicating everything they thought they understood about themselves and their lives. The room was thick with an oppressive silence, only broken by the woman's intermittent sobs as she sat before them. Tears streamed down her hollowed cheeks, her trembling hands clutching each other tightly, as if trying to hold on to the last remnants of courage she had. Her words still echoed in Jonathan's mind, cutting through his judgments of her like a sharp blade, forcing him to reconsider everything he had believed. "I was assaulted," she choked, her hands gripping the hem of her coat. "But no one believed me. My family, they didn't accept the truth. They told me to forget, to be silent, to live as if it never happened. But how could I forget? I was pregnant with 3 children, and I didn't even know who their father was." She faltered, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her confession. "I wasn't strong enough. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, desperate. And when I saw my children, I couldn't bear the truth. I ran away like a coward." Jonathan stared at her for a long time. She had once been the person he hated most in the world, a mother who had abandoned her children, vanishing without a word. He had conjured up hundreds of reasons for her abandonment, but never this. He had always believed that she had coldly walked away from her children out of selfishness. But now, standing before him was a woman broken by a painful past and a ruthless society. She was not just an irresponsible mother. She was a victim, someone pushed into the darkest corner of life with no escape. Jonathan clenched his fist. He had never been one to forgive easily, but now, looking at this woman, her eyes full of regret, her voice trembling with wounds that had never healed, he found himself wrestling with a question he never imagined facing. Did she deserve to meet the children she had left behind? Could he allow her to step back into their lives after all these years? He took a deep breath and looked toward the staircase where the 3 children stood silently. They hadn't said a word, but he knew their hearts were filled with questions he didn't yet have answers to. Between hatred and compassion, between the past and the present, Jonathan realized that he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. Would he allow this woman who had once abandoned her children back into their world? Could he let her rewrite a chapter that had been closed for so long? The weight of the moment pressed on him, and for the first time, Jonathan wasn't sure what the right choice was. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Jonathan's house grew heavier than ever. He couldn't make a decision immediately. He had protected, loved, and raised these 3 children for the past 15 years. To them, he was the only one they called dad. But did he have the right to stop them from meeting their biological mother? The children couldn't hide their confusion either. They had grown up never imagining that the woman who had given them life would ever appear again. Her appearance had shaken everything they believed. Noah had once been furious, Elijah had quietly pondered, and even Ava, who had always been the strongest, couldn't hide the wavering in her heart. After days of thinking, Jonathan realized that this wasn't just his decision anymore. He had to let the children decide for themselves. One late evening, when the three of them sat on the sofa, Jonathan sat down across from them, his gaze softening. "You have the right to decide," he said, his voice steady. "If you want to meet her, I won't stop you." The room fell into silence. Noah lowered his head, his hands clenched together. Elijah closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Ava was the first to speak, her voice strong yet tinged with hesitation. "I want to know who she really is." Elijah nodded. "So do I." Noah looked up at Jonathan. "Are you upset if we meet her?" Jonathan smiled gently, reaching out to ruffle Noah's hair. "I'm not upset, Noah. I just want you to be happy." So the next day, for the first time in 15 years, the mother was going to meet her children. When she stepped into the living room, her legs trembling, her eyes immediately locked onto the three faces before her, the children she had abandoned when they were just infants. But now they had grown. They were adults in their own right, standing before her with unreadable expressions. Unable to hold back, she rushed toward them, her arms opening wide to embrace them, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I've missed so many years of your lives," she sobbed, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her apology. She felt the warmth from her children, but she also felt the distance she had created. Ava stood still, neither returning the hug nor pushing her away. Elijah remained rigid, and Noah, after a brief hesitation, slowly lifted his hand and gently placed it on her back, as if to acknowledge her presence. Jonathan stood behind them, watching the moment unfold, his heart a maelstrom of emotions. He didn't know where this would lead, but at least it was a beginning. However, just when he thought that perhaps healing could start, devastating news arrived. That afternoon, Jonathan received a phone call from the hospital. The voice on the other end was slow and heavy with dread. "Dr. Whitmore, we need to speak with you about her condition." Jonathan froze, his hand tightening around the phone. "What condition?" A brief silence followed, then the voice sighed deeply. "She only has about 6 months left to live." In the final months of her life, the mother spent her days in an unexpected peace. After learning that her time was limited, she cherished every precious moment with the three children she had missed for the past 15 years. At first, everything was difficult. Noah, Elijah, and Ava kept their distance, unsure of how to treat her. But over time, shared dinners, walks under the sunset, and late-night conversations about the past slowly brought them closer. She didn't try to replace Jonathan, nor did she expect her children to forgive her immediately. She simply wanted to make up for, even if just a little, the years she had lost. She listened to Elijah talk about his dreams of math, smiled as Noah excitedly spoke about the books he loved, and fought back tears when Ava, though still tough on the outside, subconsciously rested her head on her shoulder one quiet evening. Jonathan watched it all without intervening or stopping them. He quietly stood on the sidelines, allowing the healing process to unfold naturally. Sometimes he would see the mother sitting quietly on the garden bench, her eyes distant, as if embracing the moments of happiness she had found, albeit too late. He knew she didn't regret coming back, and no matter what happened, she had found peace. On the day she passed away, the sky was strangely clear. Noah, Elijah, and Ava stood by her grave, but they didn't cry for too long. Tears were shed, but none of them collapsed. They had lost a mother once again, but this time it wasn't the pain of abandonment. It was a pain of acceptance and understanding. Jonathan stood behind the three children, watching them stand strong in front of the grave, knowing they had grown much stronger. When they turned back, their eyes no longer held the confusion or the hurt they once had. Noah quietly took Jonathan's hand. Elijah leaned against his shoulder, and Ava sighed softly, but in her eyes, she had found something she never believed in before, a real family. Returning to the small house, Jonathan looked at his three children, feeling his heart fuller than ever before. He knew that in the end, blood wasn't what determined love. Family wasn't just about those who shared the same bloodline, but those who were willing to love and protect each other no matter what. And in that moment, he understood that it wasn't the three children who were lucky to have him. It was he who was fortunate to have them in his life. The story of Jonathan, Noah, Elijah, and Ava is not just a journey of love, but a testament that family is not only formed by blood, but by sacrifice, compassion, and sincere affection. Despite the wounds of the past, despite losses that can never be undone, the most important thing is how we love and cherish one another in the present. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to click subscribe to catch more meaningful stories. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.